So now having discussed what English language learners are, what are different forms and understandings of language acquisition, either for primary language or a second language later in life, as well as how do we provide scaffolding and support for students under our Sheltered Instructional Observational Protocol model or SIOP model. We are now going to dive into California standards and frameworks for English language development under Title III, as well as the California Department of Education. So, just a brief overview. Um, English language development derives from the Federal Department of Education and the Title III, as well as the Title I programs. But Title III overall has the gist for guidance and instruction requirements for English language learners, while Title I also provides programming and support for migrant, low-income, undocumented, unhoused students of all of these protected classes. However, these federal programs are regulated through state-based programs that are following these federal guidelines, which is why California has an evolving English language development program. Um, we're in a very interesting space where in 2016, the Every Student Succeeds Act was approved, which replaced the previous version, which was No Child Left Behind. Um, and after that, we instituted a new English language development framework that was approved in 2017 and aimed to be successfully rolled out in 2022. However, in 2020, COVID happened, and we didn't return to in person until 2022. So our rollout has been delayed and reduced in our understanding and the way that we're integrated in English in designated English language development, which is why you all, depending on the year you're watching this, might see that your mentor teachers or your other teachers in the site might not still be familiar with this model because we haven't really had a functioning model of English language development for some time now. And so um, in 2026, new bills have been extended to fully implemented moving forward, applying this framework. They are going to be beginning auditing schools to make sure that they're in compliance with English language development. But from 2017 to 2025, there was just not a lot of growth. And so English language development is really beginning to go into a new era in California. Keeping in mind, though, that the original program that was put into place in 2017 was based on research from way back then, way back in, the 2010s. And so we're continuing to evolve and examine how this model and framework needs to continuously change. So it's very important that you all in the field as educators are being mindful of information being shared by the California Teachers Association, the California Department of Education, so that we can get the information from you to see what's working and what needs to change. But it does mean that very often educators are going into sites that are somewhat unfamiliar with these requirements. Districts might not be used to the full oversight. People are still dealing with the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic because we saw a lot of teachers go into early retirement, and these veteran teachers who've been, enacting English language development for a long time. And so coming into our programming, we're in a very interesting spot. But currently, our framework is that teachers are providing designated and integrated English language development. Designated English language development is when teachers will work with small groups or individual English language learners targeting their specific needs, such as priming vocabulary, reviewing sentence frameworks, giving them the information that they need to either be able to review previous learning or connect and prepare for future learning so that when it's whole class instruction time, they have that information. Whereas integrated English language development is when there's whole class instruction provided while also being mindful for the support that English language learners need to be able to succeed. So small group time, one-on-one time, priming, supporting, reviewing versus whole class time has scaffolding and supports in mind for what English language learners need to be able to succeed, such as reviewing instructions, having visual support, providing opportunities for bilingual instruction, contextualizing information to make sure that English language learners are not left behind. Um, we are supporting English language learners in order to access the same curriculum and assignments as other peers. We are not dumbing down assignments, we are not simplifying them, but we also should be realistic to the capabilities of English language learners and do so by offering scaffolding, support, maybe even differentiate the extent that they're going to complete it, but they're not completing separate work all together because they should be with their um, English fluent peers, being able to collaborate, work alongside them, and experience those effective models of language, those peer models. So we want to make sure that we embed our supports throughout our instruction to make sure that we are helping students be comfortable and understand the context of the instruction, the information that's being communicated. Again, do not have a designated translator that a English learner is dependent on, or that's putting an unfair strain on the student who's a designated translator to be responsible for two people, and to make sure that you are providing instruction that is contextually rich and appropriate so English language learners can process this new information. Also encourage English language learners to socialize and meet students in the class and have peers around them that can be effective models of English language. And through this, we're providing integrated and designated English language development throughout our instructional segments. State standards. We have state standards for English language development, and that we are making sure that all the content we're teaching is also connected to a state standard. And so this is why we can't just teach whatever we want. If you're teaching math, you have math state standards. If you're teaching English language arts, you're following the English language arts state standards. And part of that is also connecting to our language standards through English language development. So you take your content that you're working on, whatever standard you're at, whether you're doing math, with addition, subtraction, fractions, or English language arts, and you're doing you're reviewing poetry, or you're able to give write a persuasive essay, and you also have that connected to a English language development standard, which has a language goal attached to it. And so these standards are based on grade level, English language development proficiency, and they're separated into multiple parts. So part one is interacting, how they're interacting, and then part two is how they're learning about English language. So you will be asked as you're writing lesson plans to make sure you have an English language development goal and state standard in support of also your content information. And you'll write it as subject, part, grade, standard, level, proficiency. But let's take a look at what that is. Whoa, don't want to not share my screen. That's not what I wanted. All right, we're back in action. Let's take a look here. Okay, so here's an example of an English language development standard. You'll see at the top here that has this proficiency level of continuum. And so students are classified during the initial classification process as either emerging learners who are just entering their emerging level and developing English proficiency, expanding, who are progressing through and able to have known phrases and sentences to be able to communicate in English, or bridging, who are bridging the concepts that they know in their primary language and their development of English language fluency into effective usage in the classroom environment. Keep in mind, though, just because a student recently got classified into English language development does not mean they start at emerging. It is based on their current level. Students will classify as English language learners and have some exposure to English in their home life. So they might be expanding or bridging. And you need to be aware of where the continuum of perhaps even the multiple English language learners in your class to make sure that your instructional supports are related to that. So if a student is emerging, you're going to need to be very intentional. If a student is bridging, you should be very specific in providing opportunities for them to be able to directly apply this information. Um, when you're writing these standards, this is a great way to be able to practice and work on it. But again, it is um, the concept or the subject, the part, the grade, the standard, and the level of proficiency. So we want to be able to see all of this because all of this tells a potential substitute or if someone's grading your lesson plan, the level of proficiency that your students are working at. And then we can determine, are you providing sufficient scaffolding and support based on that? This also works in tandem with our system of multi-tiered systems for support. And I believe, yes. Okay, so previously, long ago, there was the sink or swim model of education where you provided instruction, and if students struggled, then maybe they'll get a specialist or maybe they'll get referred for assessment, perhaps special education. Then we had our RTI model, which was our response to intervention, and we'd see how students are responding. But currently, we're using a multi-tiered systems of support, which is that across all separate areas, students are receiving tiered support based on their individual needs. So English language learners are getting intensive specified tier three support for English acquisition versus other native English speaking peers are receiving tier one support for continuing to develop their language fluency because we expect them to, have and process that. This also goes across areas such as specialized academic instruction or special education, speech and language. If students need tier three speech and language support, social emotional wellness, um, even medical support. Students we only have who are medically fragile will need specific intensive medical needs. And so we're thinking for supporting our students in the context of these tiered supports. You have an English language learner who needs tier three support for developing English fluency. That does not inherently mean that they might also need tier three support for managing their social emotional well-being, which of course we want to provide, the base support, but they might not need targeted, individualized supports. And so be very well aware that we're applying this multi-tiered systems, and all these are working in tandem to make sure that students are set up for success. This is also a great way to be able to understand if your English learners are receiving tiered English language development and you're seeing struggling in other areas that you can help identify, is this something that might need additional services? Now, English language learners are not students with disabilities. Students with disabilities can be English language learners. And oftentimes we're concerned about, is this behavior or is this occurring because of a level of English fluency or something else? And this multi-tiered systems support is a great way to make sure that we can monitor and flag if students need more targeted supports to be able to determine if they need intensive supports, because we don't have a student not want to get an assessment that they need that's going to help them receive individualized support. We also don't want to flag students for potentially needing individual services when they're just trying to learn English. And so students are assessed for one or more areas of MTSS at a time. And so just because you have a diagnosis and services in one area does not mean for the other. So, if a student is diagnosed and they have a speech and language impairment, that does not mean that they also receive special education in academics. Um, or if a student is a English language learner, does not mean that they need special education or that they need occupational therapy or physical therapy or behavioral therapy. But you also need to be aware of what are the supports and what is the framework for supporting students, because according to the MTSS model, especially if you're in a general education setting, your provisions, your support should by and large meet most of the needs of the students. However, there will be students that need more additional support. And that does not mean that you're a bad teacher. It just means that through the multi-tiered systems of support, we should be reaching out to specialists for assistance. If you need assistance with behavior, talk to your behavior specialist or your licensed school psychologist. And students might need intensive supports. So if you have support needs, please ask, because it's not that you're not doing enough. I mean, there might be some ways that you can improve and you might get those resources, but it's not something that you should just innately be able to handle on your own. So please ask for support and assistance so that we can have all the specialists involved and have that careful assessment and data collection, both for English language learners and for native English speakers. And now we've talked a little bit about the LPAC. And specifically for the initial LPAC, we know that when students are flagged as potential English language learners, that they receive an initial LPAC, and if they have, diagnosed um, academic instructional support needs or disabilities, they can take the alternative initial LPAP, but it assesses students' capabilities of listening, speaking, writing, and reading. If students pass this, they will be into general education as a fluent English speaker. They will not need to be receiving English language development. But if they do not pass the threshold, then they're screened to either be emerging or bridging, depending on somewhere on that continuum. And then on an annual basis, they will take the summative LPAC, which helps assess what's their progress relative to their current grade level. Are they improving? Are they still classified in a certain area? Do they need to be exited from English language development if they're fully fluent? And to be able to check progress in the four areas of listening, speaking, writing, and reading. Um, so our goal is for every single student to be reclassified and exited. We also know that if a student is not making progress for several years, they can be classified as a long-term English learner. And we need to be mindful of that. And if you're getting your students this LPAC information and there's information on listening, speaking, or writing, that's an area to work on. Or, if you've got a new cohort of students coming in, ask for the English language learners, check their LPACs because you might be able to know what are some key areas to really emphasize and support. So where does this come from? LPAC was implemented in 2018. Prior to that, California English Language Development was the CELT. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but that was before um, we got legal development for LPAC under 2012, which was when education was still under No Child Left Behind by the Bush administration. And that was updated in 2015 with the Every Student Succeeds Act under the Obama administration. And we also recently received the alternative LPAC in 2022. And so if you have older students who happen to have disabilities, they may have entered as English language learners before there was an LPAC that was specifically mindful of students with extensive support needs or specialized academic instructional needs. Now, through the annual alternative LPAC, we're starting to make sure that students who perhaps their language fluency is more tied towards their um, specialized academic instructional needs rather than, their English fluency exited. If a student who's in special education is classified as an English learner when they're really just needing specialized education, we can exit them from English language development. But also we can, thoroughly assess and see what their language and growth is. And so we provide the summative LPAC and summative alternative LPAC annually for English language learners, which is provided by LPAC certified instructors. And if you're interested in that certification process, it's online, it's free. You can complete within 3 to 5 hours. It's something great to add to your resume, and it helps you really understand these skills in place that are being assessed. So if you know your students are going to be assessed on reading and writing and listening and speaking, you should make sure that you're providing a lot of opportunity to practice that in your classroom. This initial LPAC, though, once a student is flagged as an potential English language learner when they enter the school system, it will be either provided within 30 days of enrollment or within the first 60 days prior to instruction, depending on, if it happens over summer or yada, yada, yada. Um, and of course, if an initial alternative LPAC identifies a student as being an English language learner, they're then within English language development. The summative LPAC typically is provided in the spring. It's usually at a consistent time, not relative to when a student entered English language development, but some school districts do it differently. And it helps us understand if a student is able to be exited from English language development or not. But it's also not the only factor. Um, Teachers can recommend retention in English language development. Whether a student passes or not, districts and site can also have more specific requirements. The summative LPAC should be by and large what it is, but there's also special considerations. Um, and through our LPAC and our understanding of our students' growth, we're then providing integrated English language development into the whole classroom environment and then designated in English language development in our small groups or one-on-one. And of course, many middle schools and high schools will have these designated English language development periods. So you might not even be aware of who the English language learners are if you're not leading or part of those study groups. But you should also be aware that when those English learners are in your classrooms, you need to make sure that you're providing integrated English language development. Even regardless of the subject, if you're music, if you're physical education, you need to be providing integrated English language development. We need to make sure that all of the information is contextualized and supportive of our students' success. A little bit more about the alternative LPAC, though. What it does is it tries to meet a student's needs based on their individualized education plan, special education, their case manager. It's more paper-based rather than being digital, and it is geared towards students with extensive support needs. However, it is an alternative model, so now we have two different versions of a test that a student can take. Um, There are also special methods and accommodations for students that are blind or visually impaired, deaf or hard of hearing, or who use American Sign Language. Thank you.